If you have McDougall's flour in your kitchen, don't use it again until you watch this, because what we uncovered about how this flour is produced, treated, and modified is not what most families believe they are buying. Over the years, the production process has quietly changed. Yet many consumers were never clearly told that the modern white flour is now heavily refined, stripped during milling, and then fortified with synthetic nutrients to extend supermarket shelf life. When we examine the milling methods, the treatment processes, and the growing number of complaints, a clearer picture began to form. This is no longer the simple, traditional flour people assume it is. In this video, we are revealing specific findings that explain exactly why I will never touch McDougall's flour again. It doesn't bake the way it used to. For years, McDougall's flour built its name on one thing: reliability. You opened the bag, followed your usual recipe, and it simply worked. Victoria sponge. Rose evenly. Short crust pastries stayed firm. Yorkshire puddings lifted the way they always had. That predictability created trust. But over time, something subtle began to shift. More home bakers started adjusting recipes they had used for decades. Some reported dough that felt wetter and harder to handle. Others described cakes that sank in the center without any obvious mistake. A few mentioned needing extra flour just to reach the same consistency they once achieved automatically. Individually, those experiences might seem minor. Wheat crops vary from season to season. Harvest quality changes. That is normal. What is different today is the way flour is processed before it ever reaches the shelf. Modern white flour is produced through high-speed roller milling. During this process, the wheat grain is separated into its components. The bran and germ are removed, leaving mostly the starchy endosperm. This creates the fine, soft texture most people associate with white flour. But removing those natural components also changes how the flour behaves. After milling, UK white flour must be fortified by law. Specific nutrients such as calcium, iron, niacin, and thiamine are added back in synthetic form. These additions are required, but they are not identical to the nutrients naturally present in whole grain. Then comes the stabilization process. Industrial flour is designed to remain consistent across millions of bags. It is stored, blended, and standardized to hit specific technical targets, including moisture levels and protein percentages. Even small variations in protein content can significantly affect gluten formation. Gluten determines elasticity, structure, and rise. If that balance shifts slightly, your dough feels different, your batter reacts differently, your results change. In large commercial bakeries, machines compensate for these differences. In a home kitchen, your hands feel it immediately. So when experienced bakers say, "This doesn't behave like it used to," it may not be imagination. It may be the quiet outcome of industrial refinement replacing traditional milling practices. And if something as fundamental as performance has changed without most shoppers being clearly aware, the next finding goes far deeper than baking consistency. The treatment process. Most people never think about. When most people buy a bag of McDougall's plain flour, they picture wheat being milled and packed. That's it. Very few stop to consider what happens between the wheat field and the supermarket shelf. Modern white flour is not simply ground grain. After roller milling strips away the bran and germ, the remaining endosperm must be stabilized. Freshly milled flour does not always perform consistently straight away. Traditionally, flour was allowed to age naturally. Exposure to air slowly strengthened the gluten-forming proteins, improving baking quality over time. That natural maturation took patience. Today, industrial production does not wait. Large-scale flour manufacturing uses controlled storage environments, mechanical blending, and standardization processes to ensure uniform results across huge volumes. In some cases, across the industry, flour treatment agents are permitted to improve baking performance and reduce variability. These are regulated and legal, but most shoppers are unaware that such processes exist at all. The issue is not that these treatments are illegal. It is that the image of simple flour does not match the modern reality of controlled industrial refinement. When a product carries a long-standing traditional brand identity, consumers assume the process behind it remains equally traditional. But industrial milling today is engineered for speed, efficiency, and uniformity, not for preserving the old, slower methods many people still imagine. This gap between perception and process matters, because trust is built on simplicity. And when simplicity becomes technical, chemical, and highly standardized behind closed factory doors, shoppers deserve to understand that shift. The more we examined how flour is aged, treated, and prepared for supermarket consistency, the clearer it became that what sits in the bag is the result of far more intervention than most families realize. And that leads directly into the next issue, one that affects every single bag sold in the UK, whether people want it or not. The fortification you never chose. There is something inside every standard bag of McDougall's white flour that most families never actively decided to put there. It does not appear as a bold marketing claim. It is not promoted on the front of the packaging. And it is not optional. Under UK law, most white flour must be fortified. After the wheat is milled and refined, manufacturers are legally required to add specific nutrients back in, typically calcium carbonate, iron, niacin, and thiamine. To understand why, you have to go back to the milling process itself. Modern roller milling removes the bran and germ from the wheat grain. Those parts contain fiber, oils, and naturally occurring vitamins and minerals. What remains is mainly the starchy endosperm, which produces the soft white texture people associate with plain flour. But when those natural components are removed, nutritional content drops. So decades ago, regulations were introduced requiring certain nutrients to be added back in synthetic form. The goal was to prevent deficiencies across the population. On the surface, that sounds responsible. But here is the part most people never consider. The nutrients originally present in whole grain wheat exist within a complex natural structure. When they are removed during milling, that structure is lost. The replacements added later are isolated compounds manufactured to meet minimum legal requirements, not to recreate the original grain in its full complexity. That distinction matters, because when shoppers pick up a bag of McDougall's flour, most still imagine wheat being milled and packed. They rarely picture a process where grain is stripped down, refined, and then partially reconstructed with laboratory-produced nutrient additives. And again, this is not hidden in the sense of being illegal. It is openly regulated. What is missing is clear public awareness. No one at the supermarket shelf asks you whether you want synthetic iron added to your flour. No one asked whether you prefer minimally altered grain. The choice has already been made for you. For some people, fortification is reassuring. For others, it raises questions about long-term dietary balance and cumulative intake from multiple fortified foods consumed daily. The larger issue is this: white flour is not simply ground wheat. It is wheat that has been separated, modified, and legally reassembled to meet regulatory standards. And once you understand that level of intervention, the idea of traditional flour begins to feel less straightforward than it once did. The next finding looks even deeper, not at what is added back, but at what industrial milling permanently removes. What modern milling permanently removes. Before a bag of McDougall's white flour is ever fortified, blended, or packaged, something fundamental has already changed. The wheat kernel has been taken apart. A whole wheat grain is not just flour waiting to happen. It is a complete structure made up of three distinct parts: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. Together, those three components create the natural balance of fiber, oils, vitamins, and starch that the plant originally contained. Traditional stone milling crushed the entire kernel slowly. Everything remained together. The flour reflected the full grain. Modern roller milling does the opposite. In today's large-scale production, the wheat is fed through a series of fast-moving steel rollers. Each stage separates one component from another with precision. The bran is sifted away. The germ is removed. The endosperm, the starchy center, is isolated. That isolated endosperm becomes white flour. What is lost in that process is not minor. The bran contains fiber and trace minerals. The germ contains natural oils, vitamin E, and other micronutrients. Those oils also give whole grain flour depth of flavor and a slightly richer texture. When those elements are removed, they are removed permanently. They are not simply filtered. They are separated out entirely and used for other purposes, such as animal feed or processed food ingredients. The result is a refined powder that is smoother, lighter, and more shelf-stable. And that last point matters. One of the reasons refined white flour lasts longer in supermarkets is because the natural oils found in the germ have been taken out. Oils oxidize, oils spoil. Removing them makes the product far more stable during storage and transport. From a commercial standpoint, that is efficient. From a nutritional and structural standpoint, it means the flour is no longer the grain in its original form. What remains is primarily starch and protein, simplified for predictability and longevity. Supporters of modern milling argue that this refinement improves baking consistency and creates uniform texture. That is true in many industrial settings, but it also means that what people call plain flour is actually a carefully engineered fraction of the original wheat kernel. It is not whole, it is not minimally altered. It is processed in stages designed for speed, scale, and standardization. When shoppers imagine flour being ground between stones, they are picturing a process that largely disappeared from mainstream production decades ago. What they are buying instead is a product shaped by industrial design choices. And when that refined base is then fortified, stabilized, and standardized, the gap between perception and reality widens even further. The next issue shifts from what is removed to what may remain, because sourcing and agricultural inputs raise a different set of questions entirely. The wheat supply chain. Most shoppers never see. By the time McDougall's flour reaches the shelf, the wheat inside it has traveled through a complex supply chain most families never think about. The assumption is simple. British wheat milled locally, packed neatly, sold nationally. But large flour brands source wheat based on availability, yield, and commercial contracts. That can mean grain from multiple farms, sometimes multiple regions, blended together to achieve consistent protein levels and baking performance. Blending ensures uniformity, but it also makes traceability less personal. Modern wheat farming often relies on approved pesticides, herbicides, and crop treatments. These are regulated and monitored, but they are still part of the agricultural system that feeds into mass flour production. Again, this is not about illegality, it is about scale. When you are producing flour for millions of households, the priority becomes efficiency and consistency. The wheat is selected for predictable output, not small-scale individuality. And while residue levels must stay within legal safety limits, many shoppers have never paused to consider how intensively modern wheat is cultivated compared to decades past. That context matters when evaluating a staple product used daily, because flour is not an occasional treat. It is in bread, pastries, sauces, batters, and baked goods across the country. Before we move further, let me say this clearly. If you are finding this breakdown helpful, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. This channel exists to review everyday UK staples in a way that respects your intelligence and gives you clarity. Moving on from supply to storage, because once this flour is milled and blended, it is designed to sit, sometimes far longer than people realize. The shelf life that doesn't match the image. Flour feels like one of the most stable foods in the kitchen. It is dry, pale, powdered. It looks almost immune to time. Most families assume a bag of McDougall's flour is milled, packed and sold within a fairly natural cycle. They picture grain being ground and then used within a reasonable period, much like it would have been decades ago. But modern white flour is specifically designed to last. Once the bran and germ are removed during roller milling, the most fragile parts of the wheat kernel are gone. The germ contains natural oils, and oils are what cause grain to turn rancid over time. By stripping that component away, manufacturers significantly extend shelf stability. What remains, primarily starch and protein, is far less reactive. This is not accidental. Large-scale flour production must support national distribution. That means transport, warehousing, supermarket storage, and finally, consumer storage at home. The product has to withstand temperature and Variation, long supply chains, and extended display periods. To make that possible, moisture levels are carefully reduced and tightly controlled. Flour is dried to precise specifications because even small shifts in moisture can lead to clumping, microbial growth, or spoilage. It is then blended to standardize performance, ensuring one batch behaves almost identically to another. From a logistical standpoint, this is efficient, but it also changes how the product relates to time. Traditional wholemeal flour, which retains bran and germ, has a noticeably shorter shelf life. It requires more careful storage. It can develop off flavors if left too long. That fragility reflects its fuller composition. Refined white flour avoids that problem because much of the complexity has been removed. So when a bag of flour sits in a distribution center, then in a supermarket stockroom, then on a shelf, and still performs months later, that durability is not a natural feature of untouched grain. It is the outcome of industrial refinement. For many shoppers, long shelf life feels reassuring. It suggests safety, stability, predictability. But longevity in highly refined foods often signals that the product has been simplified and stabilized to meet commercial needs first. And when you start connecting shelf life engineering with heavy refinement, legal fortification, and large-scale blending, the idea of simple flour becomes increasingly difficult to defend. The next issue brings us back to the kitchen itself, because beyond processing and storage, the real trigger for this review was something far more practical: the growing number of people saying their baking results are no longer the same. The rise in performance complaints. This review did not begin with theory or speculation. It began with baking results. Over time, more home bakers started noticing practical differences. Dough that once felt smooth and elastic now felt wetter and harder to handle. Sponge. Cakes that reliably rose began dipping in the center. Pastry needed extra flour to reach the same firmness it once achieved automatically. At first, most people blamed themselves. They adjusted oven temperatures, they rechecked measurements, they switched mixing bowls. Because when a brand has been trusted for decades, the instinct is to assume the fault lies in technique. But when similar experiences are repeated across different households, different recipes, and different skill levels, it raises a fair question. What changed? Flour performance depends heavily on protein content. Protein forms gluten, and gluten gives structure. Even a small shift in protein percentage can alter elasticity, strength, and rise. If the protein level trends slightly lower, dough becomes softer and spreads more easily. If it trends slightly higher, texture becomes tougher. Industrial milling is designed to standardize this. Large flour producers blend wheat from multiple farms and regions to reach precise protein targets. They test batches, adjust blends, and aim for consistency across millions of bags. In theory, that system should reduce unpredictability. Yet small variations can still occur depending on harvest quality, storage conditions, and blending ratios. Moisture content also plays a role. Flour that absorbs water differently will change how a recipe behaves, even if every other ingredient remains the same. In commercial bakeries, these shifts are absorbed by equipment. Machines are recalibrated, ratios are tweaked in bulk production. In a home kitchen, there is no buffer. When dough feels different under your hands, you notice immediately. What makes this issue significant is not one failed batch. It is the steady pattern of experienced bakers saying the flour does not behave exactly as it once did. That does not automatically prove wrongdoing, but it does suggest that something within the broader production system, sourcing, blending, milling precision, moisture, control, may not be identical to previous years. Performance is often the first visible signal of deeper changes, and when the most basic expectation of flour, that it behaves consistently, begins to feel uncertain, it naturally leads to a bigger question. If baking results are shifting, what else about this product has evolved quietly behind the scenes? Because the final finding is not about texture or rise, it is about perception and the gap between what consumers believe they are buying and what modern industrial flour actually represents. It isn't the simple staple people think it is. For most households, flour has always symbolized simplicity. It was one of the few ingredients that felt untouched by modern food complexity. Wheat, milled into powder, ready to bake. That was the assumption. No additives, no complicated processing, no hidden layers, just flour. That perception is exactly why brands like McDougalls earned long-term trust. The packaging suggests the continuity, tradition, a link to earlier baking methods passed through generations. But when you place everything we have reviewed side by side, the simplicity begins to dissolve. Modern white flour is not simply crushed wheat. It is wheat that has been separated into components using high-speed industrial rollers. The bran is removed. The germ is removed. What remains is primarily starch and protein, a refined fraction of the original grain. Those removed parts are not minor details. They contain fiber, natural oils, and a range of naturally occurring nutrients. Once stripped away, they do not return in their original form. Then comes legal fortification. Synthetic iron, calcium carbonate, niacin and thiamine are added back to meet regulatory requirements. This step is standard across the UK, but most families are unaware that the flour has been reconstructed in this way. After that, moisture levels are controlled to precise specifications. Wheat from multiple sources may be blended to achieve consistent protein targets. The product is stabilized to withstand long storage and supermarket distribution cycles. Each step serves a commercial purpose: uniformity, longevity, efficiency, scalability. None of these processes are hidden in the sense of being secret, but very few consumers fully understand them, and that is the central issue. The image presented to shoppers is one of a traditional staple. The reality is a highly refined, engineered ingredient shaped by modern industrial priorities. When performance begins to shift, when structure feels different, when shelf life is extended, and when fortification replaces natural composition, it becomes difficult to continue calling the product simple. This does not mean it is automatically harmful, but it does mean it is fundamentally different from the flour many people imagine they are buying. And for anyone who values minimal intervention, natural grain structure, and transparency in staple foods, that difference matters. Once you understand how extensively modern white flour is processed before it reaches your cupboard, buying it becomes a conscious decision rather than an automatic habit. For me, that understanding changed the equation completely. That is why I will never touch McDougall's flour again. This was not a video about outrage. It was about clarity. McDougall's flour is not illegal. It is not secretly banned. It is not a hidden scandal waiting to explode. What it is a modern industrial product carrying the image of a traditional staple. And once you understand how white flour is refined, stripped, reconstructed, stabilized, blended, and engineered for supermarket scale, it stops feeling as simple as it once did. The question is not whether you are allowed to use it. The question is whether you want to. If you value minimally altered foods, you may want to consider whole meal options that retain the full grain structure. You may want to look for stone ground varieties where the milling process preserves more of the wheat's natural composition. You may want to read labels more carefully and make a conscious decision instead of relying on brand familiarity, because staples deserve scrutiny. They are not occasional treats, they are daily ingredients, and small changes repeated over years matter more than most people realize. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually behind that familiar red and white bag, then share this video with someone who still assumes flour is just flour. Leave a comment and tell me which everyday UK staple you want investigated next. And if you value calm, structured reviews of the products sitting in your own cupboard, like this video and subscribe. This channel exists to give control back to shoppers who simply want honesty, clarity, and informed choice.